Carrie and Nigan, thanks for being with us. Nigan, let's start with you. What do you think is the most significant part of this story?
A half century of a battle for justice against the most monumental forces of racism driven against these men. From every single step of the justice system, from the police who manufactured the confessions, to the Crown Attorney who pushed through on dubious evidence the charges, to every single other part, the defense attorneys, prison psychologists, the parole board, every single part of the justice system conspired together, consciously or unconsciously, to keep these guys in prison, put them in prison, then keep them in prison. And the fact that they had to fight every single tooth and nail for half a century, 50 years. The other part of the story that I wrote about in my column this week is that there were many helpers along the way. The first person to really believe Brian Anderson was his teacher in prison in Prince Albert at the Saskatchewan Penitentiary. He started to write letters. And then a TV program, an investigative program, picked up Brian's story. And then that created a cacophony of resistance for years and years, and many other people, till finally Innocence Canada, a group of lawyers and volunteers in Toronto, picked up the case and eventually demanded the federal government order a retrial. And that's what we saw this week, where they were acquitted.
Carrie, what about for yourself? What stands out for you in this 50-year-long battle?
Just looking at the two men outside the courthouse, how old they are and how long they battled and how much of their life was taken from them. Yeah, they did some time and they were out, but still they had to carry this false conviction. You know, people looking at them like they committed this horrendous crime. They had to live with that for years and years and years, and they're elderly now, and only now they get vindicated. They get to say that they were innocent, everything they've said. And it's just reminiscent of the Cusan sisters and Innocence Canada and what they're going through. And those ladies spent 30 years behind bars, and it just makes me so sad.
Nigan, what about in both scenarios here about the question of compensation? What do you think of that?
So both Brian Anderson and Allan Woodhouse kind of shied away from the discussion of compensation, but both admitted absolutely that they deserve it. There was an announcement by Innocence Canada to proceed in that direction. There was also, however, an intention to investigate all former prosecutions of a prosecutor here in Winnipeg who is now known widely across the country as having been responsible for the most wrongful convictions, many of them Indigenous, here in Winnipeg. So it's not just about compensation, but the fact that this individual, this Crown prosecutor, whose name is George Dangerfield, is time and time again here in Manitoba for 30 years been putting people into prison wrongly, and Manitoba's being forced to pay that compensation. Do they deserve compensation? Well, absolutely. And if they weren't Indigenous, that would have almost happened immediately. However, when you're Indigenous, you have to make that fight and make that argument. And so I hope that they get that compensation, but I also hope that those who put them in jail, including this Crown prosecutor, are held to account for being responsible for what was ultimately an absolutely unjust conviction. Even Chief Justice Joyal from the Manitoba King's Bench said this was a miscarriage of justice.
Carrie, finally to you here. How do Indigenous peoples who've spent decades in prisons for crimes they didn't commit adjust to life on the outside?
Unfortunately, a lot of people that have gone through the justice system have spent their entire lives in some sort of institution, starting with residential school and then being thrown into institutions. And they, unfortunately, it's really hard to adjust to life outside, a life to, where you have the right to decide what your future is. And being in an institution, growing up in an institution, it changes your whole psychology on how you think and how you approach certain things. You live in survival mode your entire life, and I really hope these men find peace. I really, really do hope so.
Us too. Carrie and Egon, we'll have to leave it there. Great to see you both.
We got you.